Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. In this podcast, we talk about energy, politics, innovation, and power. How do I usually say it? Energy, power, innovation, and politics. That's how I usually say it. So welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast, and welcome to my guest, Ruy Teixeira. He is the politics editor at liberalpatriot.com. Ruy, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Now, you've written or contributed to or edited a bunch of books, 8 of them, I think you told me, including most recently, The Optimistic Leftist. But I didn't warn you, guests on this podcast introduce themselves. So imagine you've arrived somewhere, you don't know anyone, and you have 60 seconds. Please introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Ruy Teixeira. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a contributing columnist to the Washington Post, politics editor of the Liberal Patriot, and author with John Judas of the forthcoming Where Have All the Democrats Gone? And I study political demography, political coalitions, the evolution of American politics, and related demographic and public opinion information. I've been doing this for a long time, trying to understand where politics has been and where it's going. And I'm primarily a data-driven guy. I try to look at the data and make the best guess I can as to what's really going on.
And I want to get back to this because you got I read up on you a little bit. I tried to on all my guests. You got your PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and your dissertation was on low voter turnout. So I want to
declining voter turnout. That's right.
Yeah, I want to come back to this. So, but do you consider yourself a journalist, a political scientist? If I said, what are you? What would you say?
Political demographer, I suppose.
Political animal, I guess.
Essentially, I masquerade as a political scientist. So technically, my PhD is in sociology. But I consider the social sciences, all kind of mushed together in a way. And it's good to roam around and figure out what the best approach is for any given problem. And inevitably, you trespass in other disciplines. So that's what I do.
Sure. So I wanted, I read your essay most recently on the Liberal Patriot, and it really caught my attention. The title is "The Working Class Isn't Down with the Green Transition." And I want to read a little bit of this because it really it touched something inside me because I've been watching this for a long time. I spend a lot of time in rural America. I speak to a lot of groups and travel around, and the political divide in America really concerns me. But I think what you talked about here is really important. You wrote, "Nothing defines the Democratic economic strategy more than a single-minded focus on fighting climate change, an existential crisis, as Biden and other top Democrats and a galaxy of Democratic-leaning pundits have termed it. In practice, this has meant restructuring the economy around green, quote, industries and rapid transition to an energy system based around wind and solar. Democratic elites and activists are very, very committed to this approach and are willing to pay high costs to make it happen. In the end, they assert not only will the existential crisis be averted, but everyone will be happy and prosperous." But I think you've hit something here that, to me, I call this a class issue. And our mutual friend Joel Kotkin has written a lot about this around class and the issues of EVs. And in the piece, you talk about electric vehicle adoption and how few working class people are even thinking about buying EVs. So I think you self-identify as a Democrat. And what is going on? I mean, how has the party been so detached from you? Because you've written about this a lot. The working class roots of the Democratic Party have been completely abandoned here. That's how I see it. Am I misreading what your diagnosis here?
No, not at all. Not at all. This is actually a great deal of the subject of the new book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? Trying to figure out, basically how this happened. How did the Democrats become so divorced from their working class roots? We talk about a couple of things in the book. One is the great divide that's opened up between college and non-college people, working class and elites, and the way in which that's mapped onto geography, rural versus urban, different areas of the country, which have sort of been left behind by economic development. And also what we call cultural radicalism, which is pretty much hegemonized the Democratic Party, where they've gone far to the left on a lot of issues that just are not a big concern to working class people, and in fact tried to impose a worldview on things like race and immigration and gender ideology. And relevant to our current discussion, climate. Because climate has really become a cultural issue for educated elites who dominate the Democratic Party. This is a huge issue, and they take it as given. We are in this existential crisis. We must do. It's impossible to do too much to hasten the transition to net zero and all that jazz. And, you know, as I argue in the piece, the working class just aren't that interested in it. It's not a super salient issue for them. They're much more concerned with mundane issues of how they're going to get ahead in life, material things, healthcare, jobs, wages, and energy prices. But, you know, they're very sensitive to energy prices, but the kind of people pushing this stuff are not. Right. So it does create this fundamental contradiction. So what we try to describe in the book is how, you know, among other things, climate is part of this emerging sort of cultural radicalism, which has taken over the Democratic Party, which does divorce the Democratic Party from its traditional role as the party of the working class, indeed as a party of the people, right? Yeah. Against the elites, against the people who have the most economic power. I think the Democrats have really lost sight of that, and there's a lot of reasons for that, and we trace them in the book. But I think climate is part of the reason we see that today, because there is this divorce between the worldview of the people who run the Democratic Party and its associated institutions, the nonprofits, the academics, the advocacy groups, the legacy media, commentators, and what have you, where they're totally convinced that this is absolutely true, that, you know, we're in this climate crisis and we have to double and triple down on this transition to renewables. And, you know, it's like, you know, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. And the working class is sort of sitting there, huh? What? We have to do what?
Right.
They're just, as I say, they're just not down with the green transition, but Democrats act as if they are. And I think that's a huge contradiction. And I think it has been and will create problems for them.
Well, so, and this is really something I've talked about before, and I haven't written much about it, but that the Democrats and the Republicans have kind of switched sides. And Gerard Baker, forgive me, in January wrote a piece that touched on these similar things. He wrote in the Wall Street Journal, he said, not very long ago, college-educated professionals voted for Republicans in vast numbers, while blue-collar workers picked Democrats. Mm-hmm. Now, a college degree is the most reliable indicator of Democratic preference. The proletariat is dependably Republican. Mm-hmm. So does that, I don't want to talk about Trump very much at all, because it's such a kind of well, I think he's a cancer on the Republican Party. But does that explain in part the rise of Trump? Was the working class? I mean, clearly Trump dominated in the rural areas, right, in 2020. Mm-hmm. Is that help explain then the rise of Trump and the how these parties have changed sides effectively in terms of working class people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we talk about this a lot in the book about sort of the origins of Trumpism, and it does have to do with this great divide that opened up between working class and college educated, between rural and urban, between left behind areas of the country and the post-industrial metros on the coast. Trump recognized that this was a problem for the Republican Party because they were associated with these sort of country club elites and the sort of libertarian economics and, you know, trickle down approach to economic change. And on the other hand, the Democrats had really lost the plot in terms of how they were appealing to the people who were sort of on the short end of the stick in terms of how the country was developing. And he basically spoke to that in his own, you know, inimitable style. And he was able to basically sort of realign and reorient the Republican Party towards the working class and its disaffections, considerable sections of it. And that's how he became president. And he almost was reelected in 2020. And the Republican Party itself is now, you know, by and large, more the working class party than the Democrats. Trump carried the working class writ large in 2020 by 4 points. And in 2022, the national House vote was 13 points in favor of the Republicans among working class voters. So right. This is a trend that we've seen developing over time, initially basically in the white working class. And recently we've seen it spread to non-white working class voters as well, particularly Hispanics, now Asians. We're even seeing a little bit among Black voters. And that's, that absolutely has a lot to do with the origins of Trumpism. When both parties seem to lose track of the working class, particularly its historic party, changes will happen and political actors and entrepreneurs can take advantage of that. And that's exactly what we saw happen.
So do you consider yourself a Democrat?
I do.
And why? I mean, because I'm going to be provocative here a little bit, Ruy. We just met. And so in 2017, you wrote a book called The Optimistic Leftist, Why the 21st Century Will Be Better Than You Think. But then in the Atlantic, let me see, was in last year in November. You wrote a piece called "The Democrats' Long Goodbye to the Working Class," in which you said the
Right.
party's biggest challenge heading into the midterms is the erosion of its traditional base of support. So I respect your
Well,
party
I'm a
affiliation.
Democrat because I want to help them come to their senses. I mean, I've always been a man of the left, and I'm I would describe myself, for want of a better term, as a social democrat.
And what does that what does that mean?
That means we believe, some social democrats believe in the welfare state. They believe in the necessity for government to play an active role in sort of steering the economy in a direction that produces broadly shared prosperity. And I identify with that tradition, as opposed to a sort of more libertarian approach to the economy, where the worst thing you can do is interfere with the free market. I don't believe that at all. I do believe that, in fact, government has a critical role to play. I do believe the growth of the welfare state and government, broadly speaking, over time has been a good thing for people. But I want, a party of the left should be fundamentally oriented toward the benefit, the welfare of the working class. And when you lose track of that and you become obsessed with other things, and you depend ever more on the votes of more educated and affluent people, I mean, I think this is a real problem. So I want to try to get the Democrats back on the right side. On the other hand, the Republicans, while they can correctly call out some of the cultural and other excesses, including on climate, of the Democratic Party, I would say on balance, they're crazier than the Democrats to this day,
Yeah,
and therefore should be preferred on that basis.
Right. So your choice is I just picked the less crazy of the two then.
Well, they're less crazy, and Republicans are still dominated, I think, to a large extent by business elites who have their own fish to fry in terms of how they want the economy organized. And I think that's not good for working class people either. They don't have an economic philosophy of their own, I think, that controls the party that I think would move in the direction would be best for the country. I think there are people who put forward some of this stuff in heterodox center-right circles, like American Compass, the magazine American Affairs. There are some senators like Hawley and Rubio who's put forward some interesting stuff, but I think they're very much minority voices in the party. Look, when Trump took over the country, 2016 to 2020, he ran on kind of an anti-neoliberal platform to a significant extent, and that was a big part of his appeal. But once he got into office and he had to deal with the Republican caucus, the signature legislative achievement, quote unquote, was what do they call it? The Tax and Justice Act of 2017, which is basically kind of a giveaway to more affluent people and corporations. It was not actually going to do much for working class people. It did not, in fact, do much for them. He did some decent stuff on trade when he was in office, but I think it just shows that you could talk a populist game if you're a Republican, and it might help you get elected. But once you get in office, you have to deal with the actually existing Republican Party, which is still in a process of transition. There are people within the Republican ranks who want to see the Republicans become more of a sort of a consciously oriented working class party and have a different approach. But again, I think they're minority views. And you have someone like Jim Banks, for example, who argues that Republicans should lean into being a working class party, but he almost talks about that exclusively in terms of cultural stuff. And I get that. I mean, the Democrats are vulnerable to cultural issues, but at the end of the day, you have to actually produce and be oriented toward the material welfare of your constituency.
And
so
that means more economic populism, for lack of a better term, I guess.
Economic populism and national sort of a program for national economic renewal that actually help people in broad areas of the country that have been left behind. I mean, the Democrats have their plan.
Right.
Let's build windmills and, let's have wind and solar everywhere, and that will produce this groovy society. I mean, okay, but what are the Republicans' plan? If the Republicans' plan, sort of reduces to let's get out of the way and let the market do its thing and let's cut taxes as much as possible, which, to some extent is still their program. I think they're moving away from it, but I don't think that's the right approach either. So yeah. I think it's a difficult question how to produce sort of a new, what you might call a new American system, a second American system. Back in the 1800s, we had the first American system, which was a partnership between public investment and private entrepreneurship that actually produced, an enormous amount of economic development. You look at the history of economic development in the United States, the country has worked best when there has been this sort of public-private partnership and a sort of conscious
So
national industrial strategy.
So you think about railroads there specifically? That would be one.
That was part of it. Well, it started out with canals, actually. I mean,
Sure.
there was the investments in education, higher education Act, the land grant universities. I mean, Lincoln described himself, right, as a Henry Clay Whig. I mean, he was into building off the American system. And if you look at the history of the United States economy, clearly it's been a progression with ever more growth of the welfare state, ever more investment and things that actually produce productivity growth in the economy. And we need that again. So, I mean, that's a long discussion.
Sure.
But, no, I mean, if you don't like the Democrats' approach to public investment, and I think there are big problems with it. Okay, what's your program? What is your program as a Republican Party today? Just back to the future. Let's reinvent Reagan. Let's reorient. Let's have a second burst of Reaganism. Sure. Where we cut taxes and regulations and we do that kind of jazz and hope everything will trickle down and be good for everybody. Right. So I think that's why the Republican Party are in their own pickle and their own transition, where they have a new constituency and they don't quite know how to appeal to it other than on cultural grounds. And I think that's a problem.
Okay, so yeah, I'll agree with you on that. And my line is, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm disgusted, and I am disgusted. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm a pox on all their houses, right? Mm-hmm. But when you say the Republicans are part of the party of the business elites, I mean, couldn't you make that same charge of the Democrats? You mentioned, I believe, in your piece, which was the reason why, one of the main reasons why I wanted to have you on. The working class isn't down with the green transition. Mm-hmm. As I look at the Inflation Reduction Act, this is corporate welfare of the first order. I mean, who's going to benefit here? It's going to be some of the biggest corporations in the country, big banks, Wall Street, big law firms. Yeah. They're the ones that are going to make a ton of money. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars here.
That is a problem. I mean, they're business elites who are very influential in both parties, right? Yeah. And you can sort of pick your poison at this point. But it's not like the Republican Party are themselves immune from the influence of business elites. It's just a different sort of section, different slice of the economic elites. But this is part of the problem that the Democrats had today. Obviously, they are, under the sway of Silicon Valley and big solar and wind, and some of the financial industry is in their corner. I mean, look at who staffed the Clinton and Obama administrations.
Sure.
We talk about this a lot in the book, that the Democrats really lost their cred on being the party of the working class, partly because they became ever more influenced by, their own favored sector of the economic elites, and to some extent, their policies would therefore tend to reflect the priorities of those people. And yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it does have some good stuff in it, and I approve of the idea of public investment in general, just because, and I like the idea the Democrats are sort of now more open to an active approach in terms of how to deal with the economy, and are willing to put their money where their mouth is. The problem is that's a necessary but not sufficient condition for achieving what allegedly they want to achieve and what they should want to achieve. Because you can do public investment, you can have resources thrown at problems, but unless they're thrown at the right problems and in the right way, it's not actually going to produce what you think it's going to produce. And I think that's a situation we're in now, where the Inflation Reduction Act has enormous amounts of subsidies and, you say, almost welfare for certain sectors of the economy. But it's not clear how much it's going to produce in terms of actually benefiting, for example, working class people. Sure. Noah Smith writes about this in his Substack. He calls it checkism, the concept that if there's a problem with the money we've spent, the problem must be, we need to spend even more money on it. Whereas actually, to put it in as crisply as possible, it's too damn hard to build stuff in this country. Right. If you're going to throw money at building up infrastructure and developing certain industries in the country, you have to make sure it goes to the right people and they can actually do the things that you want them to do. Whereas the Democrats, I think to some extent, they're mobbed up with a lot of interest groups and people who support certain regulatory structures. I mean, look at nuclear. I don't have to tell you about this. I mean, it's just insane that, you can't really make any progress on nuclear in this country because of the crazy regulatory regime. So, sure. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act, you might argue, okay, maybe it's weighted too much toward wind and solar, but at least there is some support for nuclear. Well, that's good, but what is that really going to produce as long as the structures remain in place? It makes it incredibly hard to develop a nuclear industry in the way that, and with the rapidity we need to do it. So
Yeah.
these are
Well,
some of the contradictions that Democrats face and that public investment faces in this country. But that doesn't mean we should give up on public investment.
No, and I completely agree. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we've seen a nuclear struggle, right? As a friend of mine who worked in the Department of Energy said a long time ago, for nuclear to succeed, you need pro-government and pro-nuclear politicians. The problem is the Democrats are anti-nuclear and pro-government, and the Republicans are pro-nuclear and anti-government. Well, we need pro-nuclear and pro-government. And you mentioned that, of course, in your piece, the working class isn't down with the green transition. But you also cite this really what I thought was an amazing poll that was done by the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, and how beliefs in climate change and action on climate change just varied dramatically, and that there were only 38%, I think, of Americans were willing to even spend $1 on action regarding climate change. And
$1 a month, a month.
And that you were, and that also that it was, that only 19% was it, or 21% were willing to pay $100. So but it goes back to your key overall point.
I think it's even less than that. But anyway, I'd also add to that, Robert, that I did some analysis that suggested if you looked at the working class in particular, it would only be 30% of that group that would be willing to pay the $1 a month, and only 18% would be willing to pay $10 a month. So yeah, there ain't a lot of support there. I mean, you can ask questions, and you've probably seen them, where they'll ask respondents, well, okay, would you rather we put more emphasis on renewable energy or oil and gas, or are you in favor of accelerating a transition to renewable energy? All this jazz. You get very positive responses to those kind of questions, even among the working class. But when the rubber hits the road about whether you'd actually be willing to, sacrifice in any way for people, no, of course not. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, this is a low salience item. It's way down at the bottom of the concerns of working class people, but it's way close to the top of the kind of people who, the great and the good who in the Democratic Party who tell us, how we should move ahead, and their associated pundits and intellectuals. I mean, it is just not to be questioned, the scale of the climate crisis and the scale of the action needed to confront it. I'll tell you a little story here that I think is kind of funny.
Sure.
Back when I was at the Center for American Progress, which maybe some of your listeners know, this is like the biggest center-left think tank, closely associated with the Democratic Party. I was there for 19 years, from its beginning to recently when I moved to AEI.
Headed by John Podesta, who's now back in the White House.
Back in the White House, running the IRA disbursements.
Right, so, and was famous for some WikiLeaks in which it was clear that the Center for American Progress, among others, was targeting Roger Pilkey Jr. with a active campaign.
Yeah, what they did to Pilkey was appalling, I thought. But I'll tell you, like from sort of relatively early days at the center, they used to have this guy, Joe Rahm, who ran Climate Progress, right? Oh,
yes, I remember.
And I remember he would like talk to the staff, and I'd read some of the stuff, saying, Jesus Christ, this doesn't sound right to me. This is like, I don't know, he seems way surer of this than he should be. And, I was always a bit heterodox, at least in the quiet of my study. So I would read people like Jorn Lomberg and people like that and think, he makes I don't agree with him completely. He makes a lot of good points. I mean, maybe this isn't quite as done and dusted as people think it is. And, so I was kind of a closet Lomborgian when I was at the center. But do you think I could tell anyone about this? No way. I mean, there was no debate about stuff like this. I mean, it was just a given that the scale of the climate crisis was not to be questioned. It's all like an inconvenient truth, Al Gore type stuff. And, this is clearly, climate radicalism became ever worse, of course, as you know, in the 2010s. I mean, we talk about it in our book. And, the center, sort of went along with that. And, I wasn't a politics guy. So I wasn't going to speak up about this stuff, but it was funny, hanging around there and realizing I don't agree with almost all of this stuff. I mean, this is like, it's just cloud cuckoo land. So it's sort of now I'm freer to say what I really think, because I read and think a lot about the climate change and energy issue. And the more I've read and thought about it, the more it seems to me the Democrats have sold themselves a bill of goods on this stuff.
So, has anyone, to your knowledge, ever moved from the Center of the American Progress to American Enterprise Institute? I didn't know they.
No,
I've already.
Just me.
Maybe I've joked. I didn't know that they
me.
had allowed Democrats at AEI, but I mean, good for you.
Surprised. There's a few sort of defrocked Democrats who are there would probably still vote.
Defrocked.
Still vote Democratic, and among the junior staff, there are definitely some Democrats. I mean, you have to realize AEI is different from the center and a lot of other Washington so-called think tanks, and that it's actually a community of scholars where people are permitted to disagree with one another. I mean, it's clearly got a center-right orientation, right? There's no question about that. But there actually are people and staff who disagree with one another. There's no official party line. And, the people are treated with respect, in terms of their views on things, and nobody really tries to censor you. So, I mean, there's very few places like that now in Washington. Almost all of them, in a sense, have a party line and are advocates for one side or the other. I mean, there's AEI, there's Brookings to some extent, not much else, there's a few international places that are like that. But so many of these so-called think tanks are really advocacy tanks.
Right.
And AEI, to its credit, has stayed away from that. Though, again, I don't want to kid anybody that most people there are Republicans and on the center right, but they're good Republicans,
Sure.
Unlike most people in Washington who are Democrats, I think there's actually good people on the other side. I always thought so. That's one reason why I wound up at AEI, because I knew the people at AEI. I knew Carlin Bowman. I knew other people. I'd worked with them. And I thought I didn't agree with them on everything, but that was fine.
Right.
If we don't agree with things, let's discuss.
Sure.
That's always been my attitude. And the idea that Republicans are all tools of Satan, I always thought was completely ridiculous.
Well, so let's talk about this divide again, because I think William Galston had a good piece in the Wall Street Journal just recently talking about the urban-rural divide, and it's something that I posted on Twitter recently, and I see very clearly. I speak to a lot of rural electric cooperatives. I travel a lot in rural America and talk to people, and they're farmers, they're ranchers, storekeepers. People who work with their hands. I consider those my people, right? Who do I speak for? Who do I want to speak for? I hope to speak for the people who turn wrenches, right? The people who work with their hands. But the divide between, we've talked about the Democrats being the party of the college educated, but it's really the party now increasingly of the cities, right? That they do that. So how did rural America, Galston talks about this. I think there's a Cornell study that just came out and talks about the fact that rural America is being left behind, but it's also being, I would say, victimized in some cases, targeted, steamrolled by big business, big banks, big industry, big law firms to force them to take renewable energy projects they don't want, right? So,
right, yeah.
But which is a siding issue, land use conflicts. I'll ask the question, why has rural America become so Republican?
Well, that's a big question, and you're right that it's happened. And again, I refer you to my forthcoming book with John Judas, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? Now available on Amazon for pre-order.
Which will be out in November.
That's correct. So
Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes.
Right.
Which is being published by Henry Holt, if I remember.
That's right. So we do discuss that in the book. And, if you want to, you have to trace the disaffection with rural America back quite a ways to the sort of economic transformation the country went through in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the influence of the trade shocks, NAFTA, you had the China shock in the early 2000s, and a lot of the economic base of a lot of these rural areas was sort of getting eroded. And they felt like Democrats basically had about zero interest in helping them out. And even as the Democrats seemed to have zero interest in helping them out and sort of acquiesced in these kind of economic transformations, they felt like the Democrats increasingly, in a cultural sense, did not represent them and in fact looked down on them. And this is something that, obviously bedeviled the Democrats among white working class voters in general, but it's particularly the case in rural areas, which are more conservative, which are more dependent on resource extraction and manufacturing, farming, and what have you, and were not part of the favored industries of that the Democrats were close to. And the you know,
and
the
those
economic
industries
change was
and those industries being tech in specific, right? I mean, because
right,
that's one of the other, oh, this is a clean industry, right? Oh, Google and the, Bezos and Amazon and,
right.
where Michael Bloomberg, right? Big donors to the alt energy NGOs, right? That these are their crowd, right? Whereas but I want to talk about the, this depopulation issue, because to me,
Hmm.
it contributes to the other broader challenges that I think are worrisome in America, which is this urban rural divide, right? It's Republican
Hmm.
Democrat as well. But I published a piece recently on Substack, my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com.
I'm a faithful reader.
Thank you. But it was about the transformer shortage. And when I talked to the guys who are
Yeah,
running the
that was very interesting.
transformers, he was saying, we can't get enough labor. And that
Hmm.
this is a longer term. If we just talk about, so where have all the Democrats gone? I think as I look at the United States now, I'm very bullish on the United States, proud to be an American. But
Hmm.
I look at the issues around demographics and workforce, and that's one of the things where I get concerned, because are we going to have enough workers, particularly in rural areas where these transformers are manufactured? So, do you
Hmm.
talk about that? Have you looked at that manufacturing? Because it is true that a lot of the manufacturing capability in America is in small towns, but they don't have that. But the employers are begging for workers; they can't get enough.
Yes. Now, we don't talk about that specifically in the book, but I do think it's a very good point, and it connects to the broader problem of, the Democrats' strategy for rural areas, right? Which doesn't really concern itself or have much to say about the kind of problems you're alluding to, but instead has sort of gaily assumes that if we sort of throw enough money and subsidies at wind and solar, some of that will be in rural areas and everything will be great, as opposed to, like, what are the mechanics of this? Where do you get the workers? How do these industries actually grow? How does this actually benefit the area as a whole? How do you get around the problems with, siting these industries and building them out? What are there are multiple problems here, but I think that while Democrats, I think, want to believe that because, in theory, some of these resources and money and development will happen in rural areas, or at least being targeted to rural areas, that the grateful rural residents will then vote for them. But I think that, the devil's in the details. You can allocate resources to X, but unless the resources can be deployed in a way that actually produces results that benefit the people who live there and they recognize as benefiting them, and producing the kind of development that they want and are looking for, I think to some extent it comes across as tone deaf. It's just like, you're, let them eat wind, turbines, right?
Right. Well,
uh,
and to respond to that, Rui, was what is this line? Oh, especially in coal mining areas. Oh, we're going to teach them to code now. We're going to make them computer software guys, right? That
oh,
was one of
right.
the
Well,
that's one
perfect
of the ones that
example.
just kind
Remember,
of
we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of work. Wasn't that one of Hillary's lines in 2016? I mean, this is exactly the sort of, classic definition of a gaffe, when a politician actually says what they really think. So, it's like, yeah, I believe you, Hillary. You are going to try to put a lot of coal miners out of work. It was, of course, then there was a famous basket of deplorables. So, a lot of the people in those areas, they feel they have abundant evidence that Democrats do not, in fact, care about them that much. That they actually abominate and look down upon not only them, but a lot of the industries and activities they have depended on economically for so many years, and that does not go down well with
yeah.
these voters.
Well, and
Not well at all.
one other point that is in this Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago survey, you referenced it, that 77% of Democrats believe climate change is an important issue versus 29% of Republicans. I mean, it's just a
Mm-hmm.
massive gap.
Yeah, yeah, huge gap.
In
Yep.
and is this? Well, let me talk about affiliation or religious affiliation. I don't know if you talk about this much in your work, but as I think about the climate change as a belief system, right? About
Mm-hmm.
catastrophism, that there is something that it rhymes with Christianity. It rhymes with a lot of religious belief about sin and redemption and so on. And Republicans tend to be more church going than Democrats by a significant margin.
Mm-hmm.
Is this part of the college educated Democrats, that the belief system in climate as and catastrophism as part of a new form of secular religion. Does that rhyme with you, or does that sound correct to you?
Yeah, very much so. And in our chapter on climate in the book, we actually do kind of talk about that, the growth of climate catastrophism as a belief system and how it's kind of taken over the brains of most people who run or influence the Democratic Party. And it is, kind of a secular religion. Michael Schellenberger talks about this a lot, very
Sure.
eloquently, I think. And I just don't think there's any question about it. Look, I live in a very blue area, Silver Spring, Tacoma Park, and I talk to lots of people about politics, about issues like climate, and they're just, you just don't have to scratch the surface very much to get this sort of almost religious fervor coming out about the climate issue, which is fairly unrelated to or untethered from any actual look at the data, right? I mean, to some extent, that religion is accentuated every day for them because, as you know, Robert, every time any unusual weather event happens, it's
Right.
all attributed to climate change. So it's kind of like this constant stream of provocations and incitements to believe that we are in this climate crisis, and this is the biggest existential crisis facing humanity. And it does form an overarching belief system about the planet, about the economy, about the weather, about what should the priorities of the country be and the priorities of the world be. I mean, it's all one big blob of belief
Right.
about, that sort of ties everything together in the minds of a lot of these people.
But let's talk about those priorities, because I think that that's the key here. And I'll ask the question this way: is what is happening in Europe a potential warning to the Democrats about not about being too focused on climate change? We see the new prime minister in Italy saying we're not down. She didn't say we're not down with the green energy transition, but essentially that was it.
Something close to it. Yeah.
Count us out, right? The big results that happened in Holland just a few days ago, a few weeks ago now, where you had this unknown party, the Farmers Party, I think is the name of it, and suddenly they're the new center of a new coalition in Dutch politics. Is that could that be a warning sign or a little bit of a reminder to the Democratic Party in the United States that you need to sober up on this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you follow European politics at all, I mean, it's the pushback on a lot of this stuff has been gathering for a while, and there's been retreats, notable retreats on the part of many parties and politicians on these issues, and they talk a good game about the clean energy transition, but when it comes down to it, they realize that what people really care about is energy supply and prices. And, if you can't meet the energy needs of the country with renewables, then you have to do it with other stuff. So we have to back up on all this stuff. I mean, produces these weird contradictions, right? Like in Germany, where they just phased out all their nuclear plants and have this incredibly aggressive clean energy transition strategy, but they wind up sort of relying on building out more coal, buying gas on this.
How do you? Well, you're a political science guy. How do you? Well, look, you're the data. How do you explain Germany? I mean, I just kind of put up my hands. And I think, and they just closed their last 3 nuclear reactors at a time when they are facing energy, not Armageddon. That's overstating it, right? But massive energy supply.
Right, and they're going to have to meet their energy shortfalls with coal and more gas, right?
So how do you explain coal? So how do you as a political science guy explain that? What is it in the German psyche? Is it something it's beyond my ken? I don't understand.
Well, I think it's a little bit. It's a very interesting question exactly how this came about, but we can see some of the same political and policy and ideological transitions in the German left that we've seen in the American left, right? So not only do they have an immensely strong Green Party, which is totally bought in all this stuff and hegemonizes most of what we would call in our country college-educated liberals, but it's even infiltrated or has a huge influence in the Social Democratic Party. So people in the more traditional left party as well have been oriented toward this sort of clean energy transition and emphasis. You have parties that are willing to subscribe to this, who have evolved in a direction that's consistent with it. And you don't have, look, even the Christian Democrats in Germany have felt they needed to, sort of respond to this, right? Be sort of if not as aggressively, climate transition people, but somewhat. And at this point, we haven't yet seen the big revolt in Germany from voters. I mean, at the end of the day, it is up to the voters to say, basta, enough. And they haven't yet said it. They may say it in the future. But at this point, the parties feel that they can get away with this. I think they're probably mistaken. I think their strategy is, sort of very suspect, and it's going to produce it's already produced a lot of bad results in terms of energy prices, as you know. I mean, how long are people going to put up with this? What's going to happen next winter? We'll see.
Yeah. But it's even the Tories in Britain, right? But Rishi Sunak comes in, he says we're going to repeal the fracking ban, and then he reimposes the fracking ban. And I'm looking at it, I'm thinking, wait a minute, you're a Tory. What are you doing? You're in a massive gas crunch here.
Well, one way to look at this, Robert, might be, well, who runs political parties these days, be they on the left or the right?
Okay, well, who
primarily college-educated elites who've gone to the same universities
and live in cities,
hobnob in the same circles, are not particularly connected to the lives of working class people. And so, if you look at an issue like climate, or you look at various cultural issues around transgender and so on, they all kind of come out of the same bucket, and they tend to socialize with different flavors of the same kind of people. So in a way, it's the triumph of the hegemony of college-educated, relatively liberal elites on both parties.
So it's a product.
It's an insularity. It's a bubble that they live in. It just shows to you that today in the West, political parties, the people who run political parties, are not particularly closely connected to working class people. I mean, the middle class people of various sorts are more connected to the people they went to university with, and their sort of a whole outlook on the world and the neighborhoods they live in. And that's why you periodically have these populist surges among more authentically working class people who are willing to break the crockery and say what shouldn't be said, and are, looked down upon by, mainstream elites, be they on the left and the right, as sort of, really uncool. And they shouldn't say stuff like that. And, they're like, these are yahoos. So
would a third party help? Would a third in the United States here? I mean, I've thought about, my assumption is, I mean, you're the political scientist, but I think Trump, no matter what the indictments, what happens next, he's going to run because he's Trump. But if Trump runs, it means the Democrats win the White House. This is the Ross Perot factor.
Right. I actually don't think he's going to run if he doesn't get the nomination, but it certainly would make it interesting, and it probably does considerably enhance the probability that Joe Biden will have a second term. But third parties in general in the country, and I don't see any reason to change my view on this now. I mean, the standard view is that it's really hard to be a third party in the United States because of the, single member first past the post system, because, we are structurally not set up to make sure that if you vote for a third party, isn't a vote for your worst enemy. Right. So that is.
But repeat what you said there, Ruy. You said something about the first past the post. Forgive me.
So the plurality system. I mean, if you run, if there's several parties, more than two in a given district or a given state, the person who gets the plurality wins.
Right.
It's not, the person who gets the second most and the third most gets nothing at all. So if I'm a person on the left and I want to vote for the proletarian, socialism party, which and they're going to get 10% of the vote that's going to be taken away from the Democrats, that's just going to help the Republicans, right? So that is a fundamental and unavoidable dynamic of these things in the United States. And that's why third parties have continuously failed unless there's some massive realignment that takes place.
And the existing parties have no interest in seeing that happen. So that's not.
So I'm not holding my breath on that one. I think that discontented people like us will still have to make our choices between Republicans and Democrats, and depending on which party we're most closely associated with, try to make the case that we need a different kind of approach here if we're really going to achieve the things we want to and really decisively beat the other side. And that's try to make.
And actively hold our noses while we vote. Then it's choosing the least worst, or.
To some extent, yeah. I mean, I think that's a lot. I think that's a lot what it's about with, many normie voters, right? As we know, what activates a lot of people these days is not that they love their own party; it's just they hate the other party much more.
Yeah,
It's what they call negative partisanship. So,
right.
all the people voting Democratic today because they love the Democrats? No, a lot of it because they think the Republican parties, it's like few fries short of a Happy Meal, and I could never vote for those people. So
Or three fries short of a Happy
maybe
Meal.
even three. Yeah, maybe even three.
Well, so let me switch gears here a little bit, because this is
Mm-hmm.
something you mentioned Michael Schellenberger earlier, and he's been doing a lot of work on censorship. And this is something
Mm-hmm.
that I've been observing when it comes to the climate and energy stuff, right? I've seen, articles published by National Public Radio effectively
Mm-hmm.
arguing that, or even contacting Facebook and asking
Mm-hmm.
Facebook, why are you allowing these rural opponents of solar to say things bad about solar, say things that might not be true about solar? I mean, actively
Mm-hmm.
seeking suppression of speech. So my
Right.
question, why have the liberals or the left, I don't just say it, have been so in favor of restrictions, right? We've seen this
Yeah.
on the EV mandates. You're coming from the
Sure.
not legislative, this is the administrative state. The natural gas bans in California. 75 communities in California have passed measures that will prohibit now. The Ninth Circuit ruling this week, thankfully, will negate
Yeah,
or
I
should
read your
invalidate
piece on that. That was good.
should invalidate all this. But
Mm-hmm.
even speech on masks, vaccines, so much of this effort to suppress speech is coming from the left. Is there any irony in that, or how do you explain that?
Well, of course, there's irony. The traditional position of the left has always been free speech is somewhat absolute good. It's basically traditionally been used to suppress the left, not to help it. And by and large, we should rely on the free exchange of ideas in the expression of different viewpoints, and people should not be repressed, oppressed, whatever, simply because they have a different point of view. That was the traditional view of the left, but it's clearly mutated quite a bit in recent times. I mean, I think you can you can certainly see it in the debate about race. You can see it in the debate about transgender stuff. There's increasingly a concept that, free speech, how uncool is that idea, right? We all know that words can harm. We all know that people can be led down the wrong path. I mean, we cannot have a neutral attitude toward what people say, because there is, basically speech can be and sometimes is violence, right? You see this all the time on the campuses, of course, but it's since spread to liberal and left-wing circles. So there's this really kind of weird attitude toward free speech where, words that cause actual harm must be stopped. And words that actively mislead people will then do harm must be stopped. Instead of having some faith that people can make their own decisions and people should have access to a lot of different information at different points of view. I mean, I think this is really tragic. I think this really tarnishes the left. I think it coarsens the political discourse because, of course, people on the other side are just going to have their own pushback on this, and you get a sort of an unproductive tussle about what people are allowed to say. I think both sides would benefit from just sort of making their point of view known and sort of providing their information. And it's it produces a certain lazy bones attitude too on the part of Democrats, where, for example, you try to explain why Hispanic voters have moved toward the Republicans in many ways, in many areas of the country. Oh, it's disinformation, it's misinformation. They're just being manipulated.
Instead of
What do you think
understanding,
politics is about? It's about like giving people your point of view on stuff and hoping they buy it.
Right.
I mean, if you want to call it misinformation, the history of politics is all about getting your quote misinformation unquote in front of voters. So nobody is completely objective. No one tells the truth all the time. And the moment you start deciding some people who present their truth in a certain kind of way have to be privileged and other people must be suppressed. I mean, talk about your slippery slope. My God, it's just,
it
it's
is
just
so.
I'm appalled really that people buy this kind of nonsense about, free speech must be limited and free speech, is some sort of bourgeois reactionary concept.
It is appalling. And I find it very, like a key reason why I can't identify with either party, right? I mean, part of it is my instincts, I guess, as a reporter, right? I've been in this. I've never had a real job. I've been a reporter my whole life, right? I don't want to identify because to me, it would, well, it's just not in my bones, right? I think everybody's full of it, but it is appalling to see it coming from the left, where traditionally it's been, well, this is the ACLU, right? These are the people who are going to defend unpopular opinions. But I
Mhm.
want to follow up on a point you made there,
Yeah.
because this is interesting, particularly here in Texas, right? I live in Austin. That Hispanic voters are turning toward Republicans, and that we
Mhm.
had was a border congressional district that went to a Republican, which is
Mhm.
revolutionary in recent history in Texas politics. So, how do you explain? I could give my own theories on this: the increasing popularity of the Republican Party among Hispanic voters.
Well, I think Hispanic voters have been typecast by Democrats in a way that, it's been unfortunate for them in terms of understanding what's going on. I mean, Hispanics, right? They're people of color. They're, sort of this certainly became in vogue in the late teens in 2020. They're part of this massive group of people of color who are oppressed by the white supremacist system in our United States, and they're all united by the fact that they're not white and they're, sort of part of this awful dystopian society we live in. That's not at all the way Hispanics look at it. They were also typecast as people who are fundamentally driven by the immigration issue, and they're very liberal in immigration. They don't really care about border security. None of this stuff is true at all.
Right.
Hispanics are an upwardly mobile, patriotic constituency who believe in hard work, who believe in having, the most opportunity possible, who want good jobs, schools, communities, safe communities. They're not into defunding the police. They're not interested in any of that stuff. And they do not believe we live in a white supremacist society. They do not believe, that trans women are women and what have you. I mean, they're not that liberal, in that
And they're
sense.
more, and they're more, and
Most
well, and that's
Hispanics are
key, isn't it?
moderate to conservative in their social views, and they're, somewhat left of center in terms of their economic views, but they're left of center in their economic views because they believe the Democratic Party, at least they used to believe, is one that's going to help them get ahead in life and going to provide decent services for their communities. Once you get out of that wheelhouse for of the Democrats, things start falling apart. They also, the people who vote who are Hispanics, they're citizens. They believe in their country, they love their country, and they don't think actually it's the case that anyone who wants to come here should just be able to stroll across the border and just hang out in the United States forever.
Because that hurts them. I mean,
That
that hurts
hurts them,
them
and
as
that's
in
not the
terms of
path
their
they
own.
feel they've gone down. So,
Right.
yeah, Democrats have had a, like I say, a very simplistic view of these voters that I think is now hurting them with these communities and in making them less capable of responding to the challenges they currently have. I mean, it's part of the way the Democrats in general are sort of misassessing
Well,
what's
let's talk
going on
about
with the
church
working
going a little
class.
bit, because that's the other
Mm-hmm.
facet of the Hispanic population. And obviously, I'm in Texas. A big part of the Texas population is Hispanic. Same
Mm-hmm.
in California.
Absolutely.
They tend to be more church going. And I'll ask the question this way: how closely correlated is church going to Republican affiliation?
Oh, very much so. I mean, that's been a finding of long standing. But what's interesting about the Hispanic community, right, is that if you look, I mean, you can also see this just in terms of basic ideology, but if you look at church going behavior, right, religiosity, control it. I mean, Hispanic, very religious church going Hispanics were voting way above that level of what we would predict from the rest of the population in terms of voting Democratic. In other words, they were relatively conservative church-going people, but they were voting Democratic at a rate that was far higher than among the rest of the population. So what's happening now is that conservatism, that religiosity, people are more, Hispanic people are more aligning their social behavior and their ideology with their voting, whereas previously they were not. They had this default assumption, I will vote for the Democrats because they're my party, even though I'm a religious, conservative, church-going person. That no longer washes with a lot of these voters. They're looking carefully at the Republicans, and many of them are deciding, well, I just can't give the Democrats the pass I used to. I feel like the Republicans are more my party, and I'm closer to them, and there are more people like me. So, by God, I'll vote for them.
And how much of that would be maybe this, as you pointed out earlier, this cultural, what did you call it, cultural radicalism, right,
Mm-hmm.
around transgender, these things that are the hot button issues for a lot of Democrats, high profile liberals around those issues that
Right.
would those be repelling Hispanic
Oh,
voters
absolutely,
from
absolutely.
the
Again, I
Democratic Party?
think Hispanics, sort of prior to the really cultural radical turn in the Democratic Party, which I think we see in the teens, early 20s. They were Democratic Party was probably more liberal than they were in some social issues, but it wasn't so liberal that and so off-putting that they couldn't put up with it, right? I mean,
Right.
there are a lot of people who are conservative on abortion issues, conservative on other issues. They vote for the Democrats anyway. But you get too far away from the median Hispanic working class voter in terms of your cultural views, and yeah, you're like, sort of stretching the rubber band until it snaps, right? So they're just going to places and saying things and employing rhetoric, like Latinx and all this other weird stuff. It's like, what are you talking about? That's not where I'm
These
coming
are not
from.
these are not the issues that they care about.
I
These are
didn't
not the
sign up for this stuff,
right.
So yeah, I think that that has definitely become a factor in how Hispanics view the Democratic Party. I mean, associated with socialism is not a good thing in a lot of areas, and obviously,
Right.
socialism has become a more sympathetic kind of sort of thing in the Democratic Party. There are a variety of things that now seem to define the Democrats' brand, as it were, its image.
Right.
That is increasingly making it distant from the median working class Hispanic voter. And I would emphasize that the data show very clearly that the biggest shift against the Democrats among Hispanics is among working class voters, not college educated voters. So it's
right. So that class then becomes more of a player, perhaps, than that. Even the Hispanic, even it being Hispanic, that still, again, it's college educated, higher class being associated with Democrats.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap between Hispanic working class and white working class voters in terms of their views about certain issues and their sense of how the country works today and which elites they don't like. And I think more Hispanic working class people are starting to act like that. So there's still a big difference in terms of these constituencies and how they vote, but the distance between them is declining.
Yeah, and that if I'll just interject my own thought here. That's the part that concerns me so perhaps more than any other. Yes, it's urban rural, but it's the class issue. The country is really dividing around class. Okay, so we're coming close to an hour here. My guest is Ruy Teixeira. He's has many affiliations. You can find out more about him on liberalpatriot.com. He's the politics editor at liberalpatriot.com. Written or co-edited or co-written 8 books. Has an upcoming book out in November with John Judice called "Where Have All the Democrats Gone?" That's published by Henry Holt, out mid-November, if I recall. Okay, so give me your outlook for 2024. What does Biden pull out at age 85 and not run? Or I'm guessing his age. I've forgotten his age. Does he say, "Okay, well, I'm going to"?
He'll be a youthful 82.
Okay, a youthful 82. But let's be clear. I watch him in public. He's an old man, and I say that as an old man myself. I'm 63 this year.
He's lost a few miles off his fastball. Let's not kid ourselves.
Okay, that's. I'll accept that. I could go take it further, but let's take it a few. Yeah, his fastball isn't what it used to be. Does he bug out and another Democrat come in? Who called November 2024? Who's on the ballot? For
an unequivocal no. Biden is. I mean, I guess there's always, and never say never, but I think there's like a 98% probability that he is the Democratic candidate. He is planning on running. He will run, and the question is, could he win a second term? And that's where,
And
that's where the interesting discussion should be.
And among the Republicans, is DeSantis the odds-on favorite? He's from
no. Trump is the odds-on favorite.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. So
clearly, if you look at the way that the race has evolved, and he has this hardcore of support that's pretty big, 35%, and lately he's been polling much higher than that overall, and even against DeSantis. So, and he's benefited actually from the Alvin Bragg indictment in New York. And he's still the guy who knows how to maneuver the core Republican primary electorate in a way that's to his advantage. And DeSantis has not done such a good job lately. He is the, if it's not going to be Trump, and it still might not be. I mean, I think people overestimate how much it's in the bag for the Donald at this point. But the most obvious second choice would be DeSantis. And you can see that also in data when people are asked, right. So what's your first choice, then what's your second choice? And DeSantis, polls very well across the first and second choices. but a lot of them are second choices, not first choices. So, a lot depends on how Republicans assess the question of electability at this point.
Yeah.
Part of DeSantis's appeal is going to be, if he ever finally gets around to declaring, that I'm more electable than Donald Trump, and here's why.
Right.
But so far, Republican voters are not prizing electability as much as, say, Democrats did in the contest in 2020, when that really turned the race decisively in Biden's favor. When the question of electability came to the fore, and they decided, yeah, Biden and not these other clowns is much more likely to be able to beat Donald Trump. So
other clowns.
Well, I speak perhaps too harshly, but you know what I mean.
Fair enough. Would an indictment from the Georgia state officials on Trump make a difference then? Because that's the other big wild card here, right?
Right. It may.
Because that's not Alvin Bragg, right? That's
no. I think I always thought it was a favor for Trump that the Bragg indictment went first, because it's so obviously kind of weak and it seems so obviously politically motivated. I think it was ideal for Trump ginning up the crazy politicized attacks by the Democrats on me, your advocate Donald Trump. Right. And I think it has had that effect. The Georgia thing is much more disturbing. It's a much more serious indictment, and you eventually, it sort of will accumulate. I mean, who knows what will happen after Georgia? I mean, enough of this stuff happens, and people start thinking, I don't know. I mean, I'm not really a Trump first Republican anyway, and the important thing is we got to beat Joe Biden. And there's just too much mishigas here. There's too much craziness. And I had to look at somebody else, and then they look at DeSantis, or who knows, somebody else. But that's why I don't think Trump has it
mishigash, or that's a Yiddish word, right?
Yeah, Yiddish word.
Okay, well, you caught me off guard with that one. So, Ruy, we've been talking for about an hour. I like to keep my podcast at right about an hour. I wanted to make sure and ask this question because I mentioned it earlier about your dissertation now, when that you got your doctorate or PhD in sociology back at University of Wisconsin on declining voter turnout. And I've thought about this as well, that I don't know if it's cynical or just realistic view on politics, that a lot of people, including me, kind of just look at it as entertainment now. I kind of look at it like a little way like, well, this is kind of like the NBA. It's kind of like, all the other things that I kind of, I care about basketball. I love basketball, right? But politics is kind of just another. George Magazine was kind of the obvious example of this. Was politics as entertainment. It's my little bit of editorializing. Why don't more people in America vote?
Well, that's a complicated question.
Okay, you have 90 seconds.
Right. Okay. There are two reasons. One is broadly speaking, it's harder to vote here than it should be. If the state maintained the voter rolls as they do in many other places, and you didn't have to worry about getting registered in any way, manner, shape, or form, that would do some to boost turnout. But the other factor, of course, is how involved people feel in politics, how much they care about the outcome, how much they think the political parties care about them, what they think the stakes are, if they can even understand the stakes. And I think that goes up and down in America. It went down a lot from the 60s to the 80s. Oddly enough now, Robert, we're kind of in a relatively, at least for the United States, high turnout era, where people are so.
2020 was a good year for turnout.
Right. So if the stakes, if people hate the other party enough, if negative partisanship is strong enough, that actually does produce higher turnout. And I think that's part of the reason we're in a relatively high turnout electoral era, again, for the United States. Even if you don't quite understand what your own party stands for and how they're going to fix things, you can definitely understand how awful the other side is and how bitterly you hate them.
Right.
And that's a good motivation to come out and vote.
And what was the turnout in 2020? Was it over 60%, 70%?
Over 60%, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, fair enough.
That still leaves a lot of people who didn't show up, and there's a whole other sort of set of debates and questions about, well, how do we interpret that in terms of what could be the possible political effects of those other people showing up? And one of the great myths of the Democratic Party is that if we could just get more of these people to show up, we would, obliterate the Republican Party, because those voters tend to skew toward demographics that are in our favor. That's a whole nother discussion, but the short answer to that is no, that's not the case, actually. High turnout does not necessarily benefit the Democrats. And look at 2020, where they barely, basically most people who looked at the data basically think that higher turnout on net probably benefited the Republicans more than the Democrats. And again, the Democrats, they've actually lost House seats. They barely beat Trump, and they thought they were going to kick his ass. Yeah, I mean, you just can't read that much into high turnout per se. If we want higher turnout, it shouldn't be motivated by partisan, motivations. It should be because we think that's a good way for politics to happen, that more people should be involved and take it seriously. And as you say, Robert, not just look at it as entertainment or a bunch of crazy people fighting each other. That would be good for the country, but no one should assume it will benefit their preferred political party.
Yeah, that's interesting because, I've been in Texas a long time, and that's always been kind of one of the ideas that, the state is eventually going to turn Democratic, and because of all these Latinos, and Hispanics, which we've already talked about, and Abbott just killed. I mean, took Beto to the woodshed in the last election. It was not close, despite a lot of people thinking it would be. So, last two questions, Ruy. You've written a lot of books. You're constantly writing essays and publishing. What are you reading now? What books are on the top of your list?
Wow, boy, I read a lot of stuff. So,
well, you don't have to name them all. Just one or two is fine.
Okay, well, I'm reading. This is completely out of left field, but I'm reading the memoir of a German Comintern operative called Jan Valtan, called "Out of the Night," which is
a German what? I'm sorry, what German
Comintern,
what?
The Communist International.
Oh, okay.
He was, an underground operative for the Comintern from the 20s through the 30s, and he participated in the original German uprisings of the Spartacists against before the Weimar Republic was established. It's a fascinating book. If you ever want, the sort of the inside baseball and how the Comintern worked in the 20s and 30s, this is a book for you. So
that's I've not heard of that. So this was the Communist Party inside Germany in the interwar years.
Right, and on a more serious vein, I've been going through Václav Smil's "How the World Really Works," which I recommend highly to everybody. It's a fantastic book, and it does connect closely to the subject of this here podcast. Because part of the problem with Democrats and people who are so obsessed with the climate issue, they don't understand the mechanics of how the energy system works. They don't understand how difficult it will be to transition industrial economies to run solely on their preferred modes of energy, and you need the facts about how the energy system works, where we get it from, how did it happen, what's it embedded in, look at all the different materials that go into supporting an industrial society. So, like I say, on a more serious note, I mean, you Comintern fans can look at the Out of the Night, but for people who really want to understand what the hell's going on in our world and in our country and what the whole energy debate is really about, I think you could do no better than to read Václav Smil's book that I alluded to. Plus, his other stuff is great too. I mean, he's an incredibly productive polymath.
Yes, incredibly productive polymath. That's true. I have a book. I have a whole shelf of his books, so we share that fandom. Last question, Ruy. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that we live in a democracy, and voters are entitled to vote out the people they think are complete idiots. So I do think over the medium term, pressure from voters who aren't getting what they want will force one or both parties to move in a direction that's more productive for the country. So I put my faith, as unfashionable as it may be to say, in the people. People get to vote, and the people will decide. And you can't, if something doesn't seem like it can go on forever, it won't, as Herbert Stein, the famous economist, once put it. And if you don't like the way politics is today and you think it's incredibly unproductive, which is a very reasonable point of view, if something doesn't seem like it can go on forever, it won't, So I think that people of goodwill, people who are not satisfied with offers from both political parties, should soldier on and keep on arguing for more sensible common sense approaches in both parties. And that's why, to some extent, I consider myself a common sense Democrat. It's neither on the left or right of the party, but simply trying to urge the party to go on the path of common sense. And I think that's really what most people want. So I think that if we keep making the arguments and people are not suppressed, then I think good sense will prevail in the medium to long term. But, I'm an optimistic guy. What can I tell you?
Well, I am as well. So we'll stop it there. My guest has been Ruy Teixeira. He is a prolific author, writer. You can find out more about him at liberalpatriot.com. You can also pre-order his book if we haven't mentioned it yet. I think we have a couple times, but we will again. With John Judas. It's called Where Have All the Democrats Gone? It will be out in November, published by Henry Holt. Ruy, it's been great fun to get connected here and chat about these things. We both share a passion for our country and where it's going, and great to become acquainted and talk some of these things through. So thanks for
Robert.
coming.
It's been more fun than several barrels of monkeys. So thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, thanks, Ruy, and thanks to all of you in podcast land. Tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Make sure and subscribe to my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com, if you haven't already. And until the next podcast, see ya.